Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. Welcome to today's exciting forum. What can we learn from Cuba's Code of Freedom for Families, called by Women in Struggle slash Mujeres en la Lucha. A Women in Struggle is a proud member of the Women's International Democratic Federation. And my name is Ellie McCraw, and I'm a member of Proud Workers United here in Baltimore City. And I'll be co-chairing this meeting along with Christina Pasion from the Malaya movement. Malaya means free in Tagalog, and they are an anti-fascist, anti-imperialist group. I apologize. Before my co-host speaks, please share our live stream to your social media. The link will be in the chat so that many more people can view today's program. Thank you very much for that.
All right, welcome everyone. We have a powerful lineup of speakers followed by a Q&A today. They include Berta Giversici, Women in Struggle / Mujeres en Lucha, Cheryl Labash, National Network on Cuba, co-chair, Matoi Monroe, United American Indians of New England, Gloria Verdillo, Prisoner Solidarity Committee, Melinda Butterfield, Struggle La Lucha co-editor, and a special message from Mariela Castro Espin, Director of CENESEX, Cuba's National Center for Sex Education. So today is the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Many of us come directly from today's protests against the recent overturn of Roe v. Wade by the reactionary Supreme Court. So we are encouraged by the unprecedented progress of Cuban people in the passing of the historic new Code of Families. How was Cuba, a small island country suffering from the cruel 60-plus-year US blockade, just 90 miles from the largest military colossus in the world, able to accomplish this historic transformation of families while faced with climate change disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic? And most importantly, what can we learn from Cuba's experience in building solidarity at a time when our rights are under vicious attack by the capitalist class, its political enemies, and violent white supremacist, anti-trans, anti-woman, anti-LGBTQ plus groups? These are just some of the questions we hope to discuss and answer. Before our speakers, we are privileged to show a special message from Mariela Castro Espin, Director of CENESEX, Cuba's National Center for Sex Education, to our forum via video. We'll also post links to Cuba's Families Code in chat.
Hola compañeras, reciban un saludo cordial, soy Mariela Castro. Quiero comentarles que hay dos hitos principales en la Revolución Cubana respecto al derecho familiar. Uno fue el Código de Familia aprobado en 1975, que además fue un proceso también de consulta popular y se llevó a referéndum. Un código que además permitió instituir ya valores importantes que se están promocionando en la sociedad cubana para la igualdad de derechos entre los hombres y las mujeres, sobre todo en la vida familiar, en la distribución equitativa de las tareas educativas, de las tareas del hogar, un poco para empezar a erosionar esa herencia patriarcal de la división sexual del trabajo. Y realmente ese código jugó un papel muy importante, se consideró uno de los más avanzados del mundo en esa época, un código heteropatriarcal todavía en algunos aspectos y heteronormativo específicamente. Pero ya, a ver, la sociedad cubana no se le podía pedir mucho más en esa etapa. El trabajo de educación, el desarrollo científico, sobre todo en el campo de las ciencias jurídicas, de las ciencias sociales y humanísticas, llevaron a que también la sociedad cubana adquiriera una cultura mucho más sólida en el campo de la familia y en el campo del derecho familiar, pero también todo lo que se avanzó respecto a los derechos de las mujeres y todo lo que incluso se refleja a nivel estadístico, porque Cuba tiene el segundo lugar a nivel del mundo de mujeres parlamentarias. El 53% del Parlamento cubano está integrado por mujeres. Nuestra Asamblea Nacional del Poder Popular. En niveles de dirección hay cada vez más presencia de mujeres. El campo científico cubano predominan las mujeres y hay varios sectores de la sociedad cubana a nivel profesional donde la presencia de las mujeres cada vez más alta. Es decir, que en Cuba hay un respeto por las mujeres, pero todavía el patriarcado, aunque ha sido erosionado y debilitado por los avances de nuestra revolución, realmente todavía hace resistencias importantes y eso nos genera desafíos. Después de 47 años de vigencia del Código de Familia y todos los elementos nuevos que se fueron incorporando, las leyes en las que Cuba se suscribía y se comprometía como Estado, leyes en el campo del derecho internacional, en el campo de los derechos humanos, todo lo que iba avanzando en nuestra revolución, ya era necesario actualizar ese código. Pero se empezó por la reforma, primero, de la estrategia de desarrollo económico y social del país, con la participación del pueblo, con sus criterios, con sus críticas y sus propuestas. De ahí se pasó a la reforma constitucional, que fue una reforma sustancial de 2019, aprobada en abril de 2019, también sometida a consulta especializada, consulta popular y llevada a referéndum con una participación altísima. El 87% de la población aprobó esa constitución en la que ya se blindaban los derechos de las personas LGBT, se abrían caminos importantes, por ejemplo, para lo que le llaman el matrimonio igualitario, pero también para fortalecer la mayor protección a la salud sexual y reproductiva, a los derechos sexuales y reproductivos, a la abuelidad. Hay muchos elementos que seguramente otras compañeras les explicarán y ustedes podrán leer este documento tan valioso que hay quienes consideran el más avanzado del mundo, o sea, expertos internacionales lo consideran así, pero además un código que al igual que la Constitución fue escrito con el corazón, con la inteligencia y la sabiduría de nuestro pueblo. Y bueno, se le llama también el código de los afectos porque se ponderan los vínculos afectivos por encima de esa camisa de fuerza que existía de los vínculos biológicos. Realmente esto tiene un significado muy grande porque a pesar de la oposición de algunos grupos religiosos y particularmente la Iglesia Católica a evitar los avances de la revolución en las conquistas de nuevo progresivas, la conquista progresiva de nuevos derechos, realmente se logró con la participación de nuestro pueblo y llegar a un código ampliamente aceptado, aunque fue el primero en el que hubo un 33% de votos negativos, pero está bien, eso demuestra las resistencias que todavía existen con relación a estos temas y todos los desafíos que nos generan para seguir transformando las conciencias que nos permitan generar una ciudadanía activa con relación a las necesidades de transformaciones sociales y transformaciones subjetivas para hacer una sociedad cada vez más justa y equitativa. El proceso de transición al socialismo es complejo y las conciencias siempre avanzan de manera más rezagada. Y bueno, pues es lo que ha estado sucediendo. Ese es el significado que tiene. Nuestro pueblo aprobó una constitución y un código de las familias muy avanzado que además dentro del contexto de sociedad socialista de derechos y justicia social. Y me siento muy satisfecha con el resultado, pero también siento la responsabilidad que todavía tenemos de seguir avanzando para educar y comunicar de manera permanente todos los elementos basados en la ciencia que ayuden a aportar elementos de análisis para monitorear y evaluar cómo va la aplicación de esta nueva legislación en la regulación del derecho familiar. Muchas gracias por su interés en el tema. Les invito a leer este documento tan valioso que ha sido el resultado de la construcción de consensos durante bueno, más de 40 años, 47 años que duró el código anterior. Y esa es la importancia que tiene, cómo nuestra sociedad está avanzando en la adquisición de conciencia y de una cultura mucho más rigurosa con relación a los temas que este código trata. Muchas gracias por su interés y reciban un afectuoso saludo. Hasta la próxima. Hola compañeras,
Yeah. All right, there we go. Yeah. Yeah. All right, that was great. So first I'd like to call on our first speaker, Melinda Butterfield, co-editor of Struggle of Lucha. Take it away, Melinda.
Good afternoon, siblings, friends, and comrades. First of all, I want to say, please excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so if my voice and I'm a little sniffly, please excuse it. It's an honor to follow the beautiful message of solidarity from Comrade Marielle Castro-Espín. I want to acknowledge that the organization she leads, Sept, just celebrated its 35th anniversary, a tremendous achievement for the Cuban people and all progressive peoples of the world. The Trans-Cuba organization says that Sept has, quote, developed important research and contributions in the sciences that have aided the development of Cuban society in terms of sexual rights. It has educated and trained professionals and activists who bring about social transformations around the realities of human sexuality. The particular attention to trans people has made Sept a home of respect, love, and inclusion. End of quote. What a contrast to the situation queer people, especially trans people, face here in the United States in 2023. Have you heard of Christine Lily Wood? She's a retired African-American city worker in Santee, a suburb of San Diego. This trans woman has become one of the latest targets of the anti-trans panic that has swept the country in the past year. On December 29th, Christine was finishing up her weekly water aerobics class at the local YMCA. She showered and changed in the women's locker room, as she always does. But that day, she was targeted for a transphobic attack. A 17-year-old girl was put up before the media afterward, claiming she was traumatized by seeing someone with, quote, male genitalia in the women's changing area. Now, trans women are women, regardless of what genitalia they have. None of the women who regularly participate in water aerobics with Christine had any issue changing with her. But the fact is, Christine has had gender reassignment surgery, so could not have been mistaken for having male genitalia. It was a setup for the far-right crusade to demonize trans people. The lie was repeated far and wide by Tucker Carlson and other fascist mouthpieces. And a hate rally was staged outside the local YMCA last week, where Christine had to listen to these lies being repeated as she counter-protested with supporters across the street. Christine explained it very well to a reporter. She said, "There's a movie out right now about how that kind of lie and hysteria can lead to tragedy. The movie is about Emmett Till. The lies of a person got that child beat to death, and that's just the kind of group here that would love to pull a stunt like that. Thank God I've got the protection of people with me that see to it that I don't suffer that kind of pain. But don't you think there are people over there right now that would love to come over and rip me apart piece by piece?" Since the beginning of this year, that is just 3 weeks ago, more than 150 pieces of anti-LGBTQI and two-spirit legislation have been introduced in states across the country, primarily aimed at criminalizing trans lives. This includes bills to cut off all gender-affirming healthcare for adults as well as youth, and to essentially make it illegal for trans people to exist in public. Doctors and children's hospitals are threatened with bombings. Neo-Nazis attempt to shut down drag events, aided by local cops. Parents who support their trans kids are threatened with prosecution. What are the supposed friends of the community in Washington doing to stop this? Not a damn thing. They tell us to vote for them, to give them money, the way they told women to vote for them before standing aside and letting abortion rights be stripped away. Meanwhile, supposed liberals like Hillary Clinton and the New York Times are joining in this turf rhetoric, showing that this attack goes far beyond the Trumpist right. The Biden administration and Congress have made it crystal clear that their priority is funding wars for empire on the other side of the world and maintaining the decades-long illegal blockade of Cuba, not protecting the rights of people here. That's why it's so important for queer people and all workers to learn from Cuba's example. Here are some highlights of the new family code approved last September. Protection of all forms of families, including chosen families, with no discrimination. A parental relationship based on responsibilities and duties. The rights of children and youth, elders, and the disabled to independence, dignity, accessibility, and respect. Consequences for violence or other abuse in family situations. Equality of marriage and common law unions. Gender equality, including for trans and non-binary Cubans. Equality of rights in adoption and technologically assisted methods like in vitro fertilization. A duty to contribute to the family and recognition of the value of domestic labor. And institutional and community responsibility to uphold these rights. The guiding idea of the Family Codes document is that family plurality, diversity, and human dignity are at the center of the Cuban Revolution. The definition of a family is now based on affection and emotional ties rather than blood relations. It's a code of freedom to choose the form of family that works best for its members. I attended an event at the Cuban mission to the UN where diplomats talked about the new Families Code and answered questions. Two things really jumped out at me. One was the genuine pride that the Cuban comrades had for this accomplishment. The other was the number of people from nonprofits and legal services representing trans and queer communities here who were desperate to learn how Cuba was able to accomplish this at a time when our rights are being mercilessly rolled back. The diplomats explained the years-long process of consultations held throughout all of Cuban society, from neighborhoods and workplaces to mass organizations, how there were 25 drafts incorporating thousands of amendments suggested at these meetings. They talked about the decisive role of young people in arguing for updating the country's family code to be more inclusive, and how they won their elders over to support the referendum. And they talked about how this was not something that happened out of the blue. It was built up through the whole history of the Cuban Revolution for more than 6 decades. The struggle against patriarchy and the vestiges of capitalism and colonialism in everyday life. This last point is very important, I think. It was a diplomatic event, so the Cubans couldn't put too fine a point on it, but the essential thing is this. The Cuban people made a socialist revolution. And LGBTQI and Two-Spirit people in the US and all workers need a socialist revolution here to secure our rights. The US ruling class has decided to go all in on scapegoating trans people, but they won't stop with us. The broader LGBTQI community is next on the chopping block. The capitalist system is based on the principle of divide and rule. An historic struggle like the Stonewall Rebellion can shake society and win important reforms. But as long as capitalism exists, those gains are always in danger of being taken away. To truly secure our rights to equality, to decent jobs and housing, education and healthcare for all, including gender-affirming care, we need what Cuba has, a socialist revolution. It's time for the LGBTQI movement and all people's movements to reject the losing strategy of relying on the Democratic Party and capitalist electoral politics. We need a return to the militant struggles of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, of ACT UP and Queer Nation, of Leslie Feinberg. And while we do that, we need to keep our eyes on the prize, replacing divide and conquer capitalism with a society based on solidarity that puts people's needs first. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melinda. Next up, we have Berta Joubert Sisi, the founding member or a founding member of Women in Struggle / Mujeres en Lucha.
You're muted, Berta. Berta, you're muted. We can't hear you. There she goes. Okay, good.
Sorry.
It's all good.
Buenas tardes, compañeras y compañeros. This really is such a timely discussion, and I just want to make a few short comments. First, I wanted to thank Mariela Castro Espin for taking the time to record this message, because as we know, part of the effect of US blockade against Cuba is that the application of Zoom cannot be used there. As a member of Mujeres en Lucha, Women in Struggle, which is a member, as Ellie said before, of the Women's International Democratic Federation, or FEDIM in Spanish, I also wanted to acknowledge the fact that Mariela's mother, Vilma Espin, was instrumental for saving the FEDIM after the dismemberment of the socialist country. At that time, Vilma was the vice president, while the FEDIM headquarters were in Berlin. And it was her swift action of saving documents and materials from that office, securing them, that preserved the FEDIM from extinction. Compañeros, this topic is also very pertinent to our process here in Puerto Rico. As a colony of the United States, we suffer in great degree some of the ills that affect the US. As compañera Melinda said, violence against women and LGBT people here have been on the rise, including against children. This has been fueled by a rising wave of fundamentalist religion sectors, which affect the government's actions and policies, and seem to be a copy and paste of what happens in the United States. So for us here, the struggle against sexual and gender violence has to go hand in hand with the struggle for decolonization, for independence. But as the poem of Lola Rodríguez de Tío says, Cuba y Puerto Rico son de un pájaros las dos alas. And in English, it means Cuba and Puerto Rico are wings of the same bird. So we can look up to Cuba's development and family code as an inspiration. And hoping to fulfill here what is expressed in the introduction of the new Cuban family code, which is said, the emancipatory conception of the family that guides the transformation of the Cuban socialist society intertwines social interest and personal interest, promotes its development, contributes to the formation of the new generations, and satisfies deep human, affective, and social interests of the person. So we know that under capitalism, this will not be possible. And under colonialism, it will not be possible. So thank you, Mariela. Thank you, Mujeres en Lucha. Thank you, all the panelists, for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Berta. Sorry, next speaker is Matoan Monroe, from the United American Indians of New England, UAINE.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for allowing me to be on this panel today. You know, the new family code in Cuba is an incredible achievement of the Cuban people, and it was born out of thousands of hours of discussions and a desire to ensure that ideas and policies properly reflect what families should have at this historic time in a socialist system. And I contrast what Cuba has with what we have in the United States, or perhaps I should say what we don't have in the United States. And I think in particular from the point of view of being an Indigenous person, of being a mother, of being a member of the lesbian LGBTQ two-spirit plus community, and of being a disabled person. I will largely be speaking about this from an Indigenous family perspective today, but we know that conditions are also abysmal for other oppressed and marginalized communities here in the United States. And I know because I have been to Cuba, I was very fortunate enough to travel with the Venceremos Brigade at one point, that there are many supports for families in Cuba with daycare and healthcare, for instance, right there in their communities. Housing is a right, whereas here, there are many thousands of unhoused children. There's more than 100,000 unhoused children in New York City alone, let alone other places. In Cuba, families are supported and the children are treated with great care. And this is reflected in the confidence of the children themselves, in their achievements, and the extension of key rights that have happened through the family code. Here in the US, children are criminalized as part of the school to prison pipeline. Many thousands of children, disproportionately children of color, are detained, disciplined at schools, and subjected to harsh discipline. Some of these children are as young as kindergarten age. In the US, it can be hard even to have a family for some of us. Back in the 1970s, it was revealed that the US government was sterilizing Indigenous women, Puerto Rican women, and Black women without their consent. It can also be hard to choose not to have a child here. This is true not only because of Roe v. Wade being overturned, but because, for instance, the Indian Health Service, upon which many Indigenous people rely, does not provide abortion services. So Native childbearers must overcome substantial hurdles in order to get the services they need. Indigenous, Black, and other women of color are less likely to have the prenatal care that they need as well. In addition, maternal mortality and infant mortality rates are much higher in Indigenous and Black communities than they are for white people. The attacks on Indigenous families have been severe and have endured for generations. These attacks are not accidental, but are key features of settler colonialism and capitalism. Because settlers and the US government have been dedicated to stealing Indigenous lands and extracting resources from the lands, Indigenous families and communities have been shattered in many ways in order to weaken ties to the land and to make it easier to steal and exploit even more land and resources. And these attacks that we experience have been meant to destroy our spirits, our cultures, break our communities, and break our ties to the land. For instance, the Indian boarding schools that were established in Canada and the US in the latter part of the 1800s were very much part of consolidating these attacks that had been occurring since invasion. The Canadian and US governments worked hand in hand with churches to fill the seats at these schools. While some Indigenous families were persuaded that their children would be better off at the schools, many families were coerced and told that they would not receive their rations if they did not let their children be removed. And this was at a time when Native families were starving on a widespread level and were very often on reservations prohibited from being able to hunt and fish on their own lands. Many children were forced to attend these schools, even at the point of being kidnapped from their home communities. Families were told they would, once at the schools, which really were, I don't even want to call them schools, they really were like concentration camps for kids. And they were instruments of genocide, but not really schools. Schools don't have graveyards, I don't think. Once they were there, the children were stripped of their clothing and put into uniforms, had their hair cut off, were beaten for speaking their own tribal languages, and were physically and sexually abused on a routine basis. Some of the children died. And in some of the schools, many of the schools actually, children were not allowed to return home at all for years. When they became older and went back home, they often no longer felt like they belonged and could not even speak their own language. Children died at these schools by the thousands. These institutions didn't close until the 1960s, and in some cases later than that, up until 1990. In the US and Canada, there have been recent efforts by Indigenous people to speak the truth about what happened at these institutions, to demand reparations, which includes land back, to talk about the resulting intergenerational trauma that happened as a result of these schools, and to begin the very hard work of trying to find and identify unmarked graves at these schools. In Canada alone, it's believed that there are likely more than 10,000 children in unmarked graves at the residential schools. Far from being over, the attacks on Indigenous families continued even past the boarding school era. By the 1970s, about a third of our Native children in the US had been taken from their families and adopted, usually by non-Native families, where they grew up without knowing who they were and without having contact with their Native families. Following a huge effort by tribes and individuals and organizations, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978 and was intended to keep Native children in Native communities. And it has worked to some extent, but the Indian Child Welfare Act is now under attack. Right-wing think tanks like the Goldwater Institute, evangelical Christians, and funding from energy companies have led to an important case that's right now before the US Supreme Court that would and quite likely may overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act, meaning that our children are going to be parceled out to non-Native families once again. There are many more attacks against our families, including the ongoing epidemic of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in the US, Canada, Mexico, and elsewhere. It's not just a problem here. In the US, at least 84% of Native women have experienced violence. While the government and police often say that this is due to the violence of Native men, in fact, it is non-Natives who commit the vast majority of this violence. Native American women are murdered at a rate of 10 times the national average. The rates in urban areas where the majority of Native people live are also disproportionately high. Indigenous women hold families and cultures together. That's a fact. When one of them is attacked, disappears, or is killed, the impact is shattering. And this is not a new issue, but rather it's part of the ongoing violence against all Indigenous peoples that first began when Europeans arrived. Indigenous children are also much more likely to be put into foster care, with many hurdles existing before their families can get the children returned to them. The violence against Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people, and children has deep roots in the invasion and colonization of Indigenous homelands and in white supremacy, marginalization, and poverty. The violence is a mechanism of domination and oppression. It is intended to terrorize, disrupt, and demoralize indigenous populations. And it is a direct function of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism. But I can assure you that indigenous communities throughout the Americas have been fighting back and are continuing to do everything possible to keep our families together, strengthen our communities, and defend the land and water. Wopila, thank you.
Thank you so much, Matoan. Next up, we have Gloria Verdu from the Prisoner Solidarity Committee and San Diego Socialist Unity Party.
Yes, thank you, Christina. I'm so honored to be on this panel discussing what we can learn from Cuba's Families Code. I remember my first trip to socialist Cuba back in November 2000. I attended the Second World Meeting of Friendship and Solidarity. I have the poster that was given to all the participants. The poster has a quote from Jose Marti. The quote translates to, "The world is a beautiful temple where all men on earth fit in peace." Now, I know now, and I knew then, that all men translates to all humanity. We all fit in peace on this beautiful earth, our home. The reason I went on this trip was I wanted to see what socialism looked like. The conference was attended by over 60 countries condemning the US 40-year blockade. I came with a delegation. Buses took us to the many programs on our packed schedule. We visited factories, polyclinics, communities where we learned about the committees for the defense of the revolution. There were cultural performances in these communities. The daily events gave the delegates a chance to experience the life of people with a government that is concerned with the needs of the people rather than profits. The delegates gathered daily at the Karl Marx Theater, which was within walking distance from our hotel. Some of us walked to the theater. When I went walking, I did not feel any restrictions, though I did not wander off too far. We didn't know if President Fidel Castro would speak at any of the conference gatherings. I figured not. With the thousands of people there, it would be a big security risk. On our final meeting at the Karl Marx Theater, Fidel Castro appeared on the stage. No bulletproof glass barriers, no extra security checks that I was aware of. Fidel began to speak. We were given devices for interpretation. People listened and listened until it was time for discussion, when people began asking questions, at which time Fidel Castro gave lengthy, thoughtful answers to the questions, not only from the delegates, but from Cuban workers. At one point, a child ran on stage and Fidel gave him a hug and said something that I could tell was a show of affection.
Oh, that's my guy. Oh. One second, folks.
Doctors are with the communities they serve. You know who smokes, drinks, takes drugs, prescribed or not, mental illness, promiscuous teenagers, intimate details that individuals voluntarily share with their doctors. Doctors know the health of families in their communities through home visits, family counseling. Doctors were told things that we in the US would not dare tell our primary care provider, because it could mean higher monthly costs for those who have health insurance coverage, changing healthcare providers, which means transferring all your health history to another doctor. You can be denied coverage or even lose your job because of a chronic healthcare issue. Healthcare is a huge problem in the US. There have been many reforms, many updates to the healthcare system, and yet in 2021, there are millions of people in the US that have minimal or no healthcare insurance at all. I continue to learn what socialism looks like and how participatory democracy works. I was impressed with the way Cubans at home and abroad were informed or involved in the decision-making process of updating Cuba's Families Code. Some 6.5 million people participated. I could be wrong, but that's what I saw. Some 6.5 million people participated, a sincere display of democratic centralism. I am an organizer with the Socialist Unity Party's Prison Solidarity Committee. One of the many things that really register with me in Cuba's Families Code is its promise to promote happy, healthy families. Everyone is covered. Great-grandparents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, in-laws, close partners, the most senior members of the young to the youngest, and everyone in between. You choose your family. It also promotes the right to a family life free from violence and unprovoked stress, a family life that values love, affection, solidarity, and responsibility. I recently attended a day of solidarity with formerly incarcerated families in California's capital, Sacramento. It is just so many things that is wrong with the criminal justice system in the US, which is why we know that the US criminal justice system cannot be reformed or updated. We must shut it down. You can see and feel the grief and stress of the families with loved ones in prison and those recently released who have difficulties transitioning to life outside of prison. Housing, healthcare, jobs, community acceptance are all some of the obstacles that formerly incarcerated individuals face. There are over 2 million people in prison and millions detained in immigration centers and holding cells awaiting litigation affecting millions of families. Geraldo Hernandez, one of the Cuban Five who is now head of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, said, "Our purpose is to help. We talk with the family, we encourage the family to stay involved because it is understood that the family suffers when a loved one is incarcerated. Prisoners need not be discriminated against because they went to jail. Our objective is not to make a repressive action against those persons, but to help those persons who are victims themselves in many cases." Cuba's neighborhood CDRs, Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, number 138,000 with over 8 million members and continue to work on programs and solutions to the problems of petty crime, drugs, and mental illness. The United States incarcerates more of its youth than any other country in the world. Most states continue to use outdated and harmful training school models, confining children in remote prison-like facilities, cut off from their families and communities, overcrowding and violence, prosecution of youth as adults, and the long-term consequences of incarceration on the individual's chances for success in adulthood is a huge controversial. President Miguel Diaz-Canel stated, "Before our people and the world, Cuba has no one under 16 years of age imprisoned." The people in the US have a lot to learn from Cuba's Families Code, especially from the process in which the code was passed. All citizens over 16 years of age are eligible to vote in the Families Code referendum. The code must receive more than 50% of the valid votes to be applied as a law. According to the data, I'm not sure on this, is just something that I read, it says 61% of those who were consulted on the referendum said they were in favor of the new code. We must support Cuba by demanding the US government end the now 60-year blockade and remove Cuba from the state-sponsored terrorist list. We must demand that we normalize relations and create an open dialogue with Cuba. We must learn about socialism and participatory democracy. Socialism is the path to a better world for everyone. Thank you so much.
That was great. All right. Our last speaker is Cheryl Labash, who is the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Well, I really want to thank all of the speakers who addressed so many different aspects, and how the Families Code, the new Cuban Families Code, is something that we certainly wish to implement as much as we can, or at least emulate here in our communities. 60 years is a long time, but that's how long the United States government, as Ellie and also Gloria said, has engaged in this war against Cuba. It's been led by both Democrats and Republicans. But even before that, the Eisenhower administration recognized that Fidel and the July 26th movement, Raul, Che, Almeida, Camilo, Vilma, Heidi, Celia, Melba, and so many more would stay true to their promise of liberation, equality, and sovereignty for all the Cuban people. An April 6, 1960 State Department memo admitted that the Cuban people supported the revolution. So it prescribed the path that has been taken by the US since then until today. And I quote their words, that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. And while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. And note, adroit and inconspicuous. They don't want people to see what they're doing. Although the goal didn't change, the tactic did on December 17th, 2014. That's when President Obama and President Raul Castro agreed to begin a different road. President Obama even visited Cuba. And as a result, many people now wrongly believe that the blockade ended then. Some things were eased, particularly travel, but behind it all, the coercive measures that are the blockade continued. Then in June 2017, then President Trump declared he would return to that failed direction that was outlined by the State Department memo in 1960. And shortly thereafter, the pandemic. Cuba closed its main source of hard currency that it needed to trade, tourism, and used its reserves to save lives, developing 5 COVID vaccines, 3 of which are now in emergency use, and sent its famous Henry Reeve brigades to countries needing help against the pandemic. In solidarity, the United States saw its opportunity to use the pandemic as a weapon. 243 new measures aimed to block any financial responsibilities were passed and leveled against Cuba. Surely the Cuban people would be desperate enough, they hoped, to embrace capitalist landlords, bankers, and bosses. But of course, they were wrong. Then, as a parting shot, after the 2020 Biden election, Cuba was again declared a state sponsor of terrorism. Certainly an insult as well as an injury to Cuba. Although President Biden has been in office 2 years, he has virtually done nothing to lift the pressure on the Cuban people. The state sponsors of terrorism can be lifted merely with a letter from Biden to Congress. Instead, we've been inundated with propaganda about human rights to justify turning back the changes made by the Obama administration in 2014 and 2015. There is no alternative truth. The fact is, Cuba is not a state sponsor of terrorism, but has been targeted by terrorist acts organized and financed in the United States. The fact is, the intensified blockade has hurt Cuban families on both sides of the Florida Straits. And Cubans in Miami for 3 years have said, end the blockade in the streets, in caravans, every single month. And the blockade hurts farmers in the US, workers, and ordinary people too. Cuba has developed medical treatments that make 70% of diabetic amputations unnecessary, a lung cancer vaccine that prolongs the quality of life of patients. And guess what? The US categories of so-called legal travel, the only country in the world that people in the US need to declare a US government designated category in order to travel to. One of those categories is not medical treatment. So more than 44 million US residents are represented by government and labor organizations, school boards, county commissions that say, unblock Cuba. 60 years is too long. This campaign needs you. It needs you to act now. Ways to do it will be put in the chat or possibly in the Q&A so that you can find a way to contribute. The people of the United States oppose the blockade. It's our job to show it. End the blockade, get Cuba off the list, bring the Families Code and the spirit of the Families Code into our communities across the United States. Thank you very much.
Oh, Ellie, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks to all our wonderful speakers. We will now open up for Q&A. You can find the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window and put your questions in there. If you can't find it, then you can just post them to the chat, and we'll do our best to go back and forth. We're going to take like a couple questions at a time before asking the panelists to respond to the questions. So that's just how we're going to do it. And while participants are doing that, we're going to play a short video from Value the Beast, which was produced prior to the referendum that passed for the new Families Code. If we can find it, 1 second. It's in the thing. It's in this. Yeah, feel free to keep sending in questions while we get this this short video. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
De la familia, que viene a remover todo lo que son las bases del patriarcado, del costumbrismo, del machismo.
Me siento muy orgullosa, a pesar de los trabajos que pasa uno diariamente combatiendo con los estereotipos, con la sociedad, construir una familia totalmente diferente a cualquier familia tradicional.
Siempre quise tener hijos. Conocimos a Liuba y a Lice. Se empezó a dar esa cosquillita, ese interés en comenzar a crear algo.
Estamos armando nuestra propia historia de familia. Es inspiración de todo lo que uno quiera hacer y puede hacer.
No somos 4 personas que viven juntas. Somos 2 parejas, una pareja gay y una pareja lesbiana que decidieron compartir un proyecto de vida, con lo cual han hecho una familia. En un principio el proyecto era 2 madres lesbianas que deciden tener su nené. No encontraba donante, no encontraba asistencia porque evidentemente no la hay, no existe, es nulo. Porque si no eres mujer heterosexual no tienes derecho a acudir a las clínicas de reproducción asistida.
Ya agotamos todas las vías legales, vamos a hacerlo en la casa.
Y encontré el donante. Él accedió porque él tenía el mismo problema que yo, pero los hombres están peor, más marginados.
Yo siento mucho orgullo de ser padre. No necesariamente tengo que ser el padre biológico de una persona para sentirme padre. Alejandro, bueno, es la pareja que me acompaña.
Compartimos todas y cada una de las obligaciones, y no solo con la niña, también con Laura, porque Laura sí es de una relación anterior que Lisset tuvo. Por tanto, si ellos dos se integraban al proyecto familiar y no se podía dejar exenta del mismo cariño que iba a recibir la que estaba por venir a Laura. Y eso lo hemos logrado.
Muy pocos niños en el mundo tienen el placer y el privilegio de ser tan amados por tantas personas.
Porque no solo me estás violando mi derecho como ser humano, sino que además estás violando el derecho del niño. Ahí no le puede faltar ninguno de los integrantes de la familia.
El código de la familia sería el reconocimiento de que tanto Alejandro como yo legalmente podremos tener voz y voto sobre Ainhoa. Sería la posibilidad de que si el día de mañana yo quisiera volver a salir en estado, hacerlo legalmente y no correr el riesgo que corrimos con Liwa.
En el momento en que Ainhoa iba a nacer, una doctora dijo, hay que proteger a esta niña porque va a tener una repercusión dentro de la sociedad.
Yo creo que los derechos no se refrendan, pero bueno, ya que lo vamos a llevar a referéndum, para mí sería genial que se aprobara. Este código va a ser incluso vanguardista para Latinoamérica. Vienen recogidos todos estos derechos que se nos han negado a las mujeres y en especial a las mujeres lesbianas. El código de la familia en Cuba está desmontando un código anterior, rígido, homófobo. Va a cambiar la mentalidad de este país y la manera de asumir las infancias, las reproducciones, las adolescencias y las responsabilidades parentales.
That was so cute. All right, cool. So we have a lot of questions in now. I guess we can just get started. So first question is from Lenny Villagone Gomez Reeves. Not a problem for those who speak Spanish, but the subtitles seem to have nothing to do with the simultaneous word of Compañera Mariela Castro. That was from the first video we played. Yeah, sorry about that, y'all. From Norma J.F. Harrison, capitalism produces loneliness, separates families, communities by age and other structures. Yep, very true. I'll go down. Oh yeah. They continue to say religion is the device to make us disdain ourselves, to disparage ourselves, to seek guidance from a person/system who pretends they talk to the God people are made to fear, a God that people have to hate, as it is told us the God hates us. Very true, very true. From Gasso Goba, how is child sexual abuse addressed in the new code, and how are preventative measures implemented into sex education in Cuba? Are there programs to divert children who sexually harmed to learn about consent and bodily autonomy? Does anyone want to take that question?
I can just say a little bit based on what I learned in the conversation with the Cuban diplomats. I don't know specifics on this point, but one thing that they emphasized was that first of all, it's a work in progress, implementing like the whole society, all of the structures of the court system, the family support systems, the mass organizations are being mobilized to figure out the best ways to implement the measures in the document, in the Families Code. And it's a work in progress. But the fundamental change for children and parents in this Families Code is that there's no longer a inequality in rights between children and parents. Children now have the same rights and society is obligated to treat them with the same rights that they would the parents, and the parents do not have any perceived right to basically own their children like we have in capitalist society. So that a child who is being abused can be have it addressed as any other person would who's being abused between two adults, and that would greatly increase the ability of children who are suffering abuse, whether sexual or violence or other things, to be liberated from that. I think also very connected to that and really important, at least from a LGBTQI perspective, is the change from to recognizing chosen families as equal to blood relatives. Because if you know about the history of queer people in this country and around the world, one of the things that has been central to queer life has been that people form chosen families when children and young people are kicked out of their homes by parents who are not accepting or not accepted by their communities. And so this provides, so in Cuba now, families that are created in that way, or like the folks that we saw in the lovely video just before this, have equal standing with any other more traditional form of family. So that's, like I said, I'm sorry, I don't have any specifics on the question, but I think that sort of gives you a framework to understand what they're trying to do.
Yep. Thank you, Melinda. Umberto, do you want to chime in?
I wanted to address the concern of Lenny Villagomez Reeves about the subtitles. I can attest, I am completely bilingual by force. I had to learn English because it was imposed in Puerto Rico. But I can even send you the transcription of Mariela's talk in Spanish, and it's translation by a professional translator in English. And it does, you said that it has nothing to do with the simultaneous word of compañera. It has nothing to do because it's another language, it's in English. And of course, the lip sync will be very different, will be in Spanish and you read in English. But I can send you completely the two side-by-side documents. In terms of, what was the other? There was something about, I cannot find it now, but there was something about children, sexual violence, something like that. And I, sometimes we try to understand Cuba's Cuba's law and Cuba's interpretation of law from the viewpoint of capitalists, from the capitalist society. For example, in here in Puerto Rico, there is a stress on repression, on punishment, and that, particularly in the latest years, has taken the focus on the person. So it's more important the punishment without knowing the circumstances of the person and the help that that person needs to strive and be a better human being. There are many examples here in Puerto Rico how, the state has taken children out of the house because, and there was a recent, just last week, a baby 4 months old had fractures, rib fractures, and the state removed the baby. The parents are saying she has an illness which is genetic of the fragility of the bones, and these which are fractured spontaneously, and the state wouldn't even see that. They removed it, and they will then make amends or make a test, and to prove or disprove that. Instead of, if you suspect something, send somebody, give the family a focus. Don't separate the child, the baby in this case, and have somebody to completely 24 hours monitor that, to make sure that if you suspect there is a battering by the parents, that can be avoided. And these are so many cases that we can show. But again, we have to see Cuba, and this, what is beautiful about this family code is how important is the human being, regardless of the age and the capacity or discapacity, and how important it is to make it thrive and to protect. And that is, and regardless of what happens, then, sometimes punishment cannot be stated until the case is seen and studied. So it's very difficult. But that's what the tribunals in Cuba are, to improve the lives of the people, not just to punish. The other thing, I know there are so many, we're not experts on the family code. We're reading it, we're studying it. Compañera Melinda has gone to, the exposition by the minister and the foreign relations minister in New York. But if there is any particular important question that we cannot address here, I personally will make sure that question goes to Mariela Castro for her response whenever she can. She's now in a Congress. But I can assure you that it will be responded properly. That's it.
Thanks, Berta. Does anyone else want to try tackling this one, or are we good? We'll get it. There's more questions to get to. Neil Tupes asks, how does Indigenous people view the Cuban family code in terms of its application to the idea of what is a family? So that might be one for Matolin. You're muted, by the way. Happens to all of us.
I'm sorry, can you read it to me? What is the question?
So how do Indigenous people view the Cuban family code in terms of its application to the idea of what is a family.
Well, I will say this, I don't speak for all Indigenous people.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I would say that there are no doubt many Indigenous people who are unaware of the Cuban Family Code and the provisions of it. So I don't think I can respond to that. There is another question that I would like to respond to, which is that someone asked if, it's at 356, asked if LGBTQ plus Indigenous people, prisoners see themselves as part of the greater working class that have everything in common in terms of their interests, and has the capitalist system as a common enemy that aims to divide the working class into these different identities. I'll respond to that by saying that for a long time, Indigenous people were largely kept out of the working class in the United States because we lacked access to many jobs. And, you know, people, for instance, who were forced onto reservations, there were not jobs there, and people were not even able to leave the reservations without a pass from the so-called Indian agent, something that the apartheid regime in South Africa certainly adopted later on. So many of us certainly are part of the working class now, but I guess I'm not, and I think that there's quite a few Indigenous people who are anti-capitalist, because I think that many of us, certainly not all of us, have seen what capitalism has done not only to us, but to the land and the water, with nonstop exploitation of resources and greed. However, I would say that as to the last part of the question, which is that the capitalist system aims to divide us into these different identities, I don't think that's the case. I think that we do have different identities, and I think that's fine. I think it's very important to have a concept that we do have different experiences and different relations to the land and the country in which we live, and different historical as well as contemporary experiences. And I think that that's all fine. And I don't think that that needs to divide us. I would say that Indigenous people this is our land. We have a very different relationship to the land as a result of that. And some of the things that we would want out of liberation would be different than some other people in the working class might want. And in particular, there's a very powerful movement that's now being called Land Back, but that's been in existence, in fact, for centuries. It's what our ancestors always wanted, which was to get our land back because our land is stolen. So, you know, and I would say that because of historical experiences, for instance, there's many Black people in this country, and certainly Latino people, who have a different relationship to the land as well, very often, for historical reasons. So I don't think that we can negate that. I think that, you know, to me, we need to think about plurinationalism, that is, that we have different experiences and we have different things that we need as communities, and we need to be respectful of that in any revolutionary movement that we're in, and not just say, you know, try to wipe that out and act as though these identities divide us. I think that we can all, you know, I know, you know, we do this in our work every day, and I think probably most of the people on this call who are organizers do this on our work every day, that people who have different identities are more than capable of working together toward common goals. And you know, I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. I think there's this myth that having different identities and expressing those identities somehow divides us, and it's a bad thing. And I don't think that it needs to be that way.
Mm-hmm. Someone else want to, well, that's a great answer, I think. Next, from Andrew Mayton, he says, I may have missed it, but can anyone speak to the status of gender affirming medical procedures in Cuba versus the US?
I'll say a little bit, and maybe Cheryl has more information, but to my understanding, gender affirming medical measures from HRT to surgery to everything in between, the main limits on it in Cuba have to do with the blockade and the all the cascading measures that come from the US blockade, limiting Cuba's ability to trade and have all the resources it needs. There was a really interesting post actually from the NNOC recently talking about how Cuba spends spends about 10% of what the US spends per person on healthcare, and yet has a much higher level of quality of care and life expectancy. And Cuba has an extraordinary public healthcare system that's free to everyone from cradle to grave, including gender affirming care. The only limits have to do with what their resources are. Cuba is a poor country because of the US blockade, and with lifting the blockade and helping Cuba to strive forward is going to make more care available. But I think any of us who live in this country, whether we're trans or not, we all know how horrible the healthcare system is, how expensive it is, how hard it is to get approved for things that you need. And those blocks don't exist in Cuba's healthcare system. It's purely about the resources that are available to them. And I know for many years that gender reassignment surgery and other gender affirming care has been available free in Cuba for those who want it. It's just, it takes time because the resources aren't there.
Thank you, Melinda. Did you want to chime in, Cheryl?
What Melinda said is true. The limitations are by the blockade and the economic conditions that are forced on Cuba by these coercive measures. Trying to, it's an interesting thing that is said frequently. If socialism doesn't work, why does the United States spend so much time and effort trying to discredit it and put roadblocks in its way? Take the blockade away. You think Cuba's a failed state? Get your boot off its neck and see. That's really what's needed. There are people who've been elected to the government in the National Assembly who are trans people. There are this didn't wait for the families code. The thing now, as was described in that video, is that in cases of in vitro fertilization, for example, or surrogacy, those things probably happen, but there was no legal right for you to go to if you were in a lesbian relationship or other non-heteronormative relationship. There was no legal avenue for you to access those benefits, and now there are, and that's really a big step forward. But we need to end the blockade fundamentally so that Cuba can develop in all of the ways that it shows so much promise.
You gotta unmute Cheryl to finish.
Okay.
Thanks, Cheryl. So we have to wrap up soon, but there's like a lot of different comments and questions. So I'll just read all of them, and then folks can just do a summation at the end. Okay. So you go. So Neil says, how are the achievements of Cuba, the ideas for the Cuban Revolution and Cuba's policies that well known to the Puerto Rican people? And then Brandy says, to get the word out to help their caravan in solidarity with Puerto Rico, members from their Phoenix caravan against the blockade invite people from Puerto Rico living in Phoenix to join their monthly events. We can paste the link in the chat, yeah, for that. Thanks, Brandy. Someone else says they ask if there are limits to what is recognized as a family. Like, for example, can a group of friends from a family, can people be part of multiple families? I believe that is true, so I can just answer that now. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Neil says that he lives in Hawaii. Do we know of any Cuban organization groups on the island that he may not be aware of? I'm not entirely sure about that, but maybe someone else on the call might be able to help with that. Paige says, thank you for this presentation. Can you touch upon how the new families code in Cuba will impact the rest of Latin America? Does this set a precedent for other countries in South and Central America and the Caribbean to follow? Someone then says, can you put a link to the video of Belly the Beast in the chat, please? Van Green, our friend, says, thank you all for inviting her and keeping her updated. No problem, Van. Always. Thanks for coming. Deborah says, will it be possible to get a copy of the link to Mariela Castro Espin's message? People want a lot of links. Yes, we're going to put all that in the chat before we head out. Rita says, please tell us what we can do to push Biden to remove Cuba from the list, I'm assuming. Basically stay in touch, because like that's like a lot what a lot of like the Cuban solidarity movement does.
Yeah.
But,
Can I speak to that one, please?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, one thing, and Rita's really on this, is you can get your city council or your union or your neighborhood group, your student group at the university or community college to pass a resolution to take Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Just in this past week, there was a city council and a union labor council, not just a local, that passed resolutions both to end the blockade and to take Cuba off the list. You can go to nnOC.org and get a toolkit on how to do a resolution to, in your local community. So please, nnOC.org. Rita's been a real mainstay in developing that toolkit. So thank you.
Yeah. Down further, past Van's comments. Next one. Andrew says just his own interpretation of the family code. If a child has the same rights as a parent, then he imagines they have the same right to press charges. However, that translates to Cuban law against a sexual abuser without the help or approval of a parent or guardian, unlike here in the U.S. Folks are nodding, so I guess that's true, yeah. And I think that's the last of the Q&A questions. Do we have any more in the chat? No. Okay. Sorry for that, like whirlwind of questions and comments. Do folks, do our panelists have any final sort of summation or like closing comments?
May I?
Yeah, go ahead, Mama. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you to all my fellow panelists for the great answers to the questions. I thought Matoi's was especially good on the question of the unity of the working class. I think Cuba has a really, we should learn from Cuba on how they view the working class also, and it's reflected in the Families Code and what they say, that the Families Code doesn't restrict anyone's rights, it only expands rights. And, the working class in the United States, like the working class in Cuba, is broad and big and diverse and expansive. Some parts of the working class are targeted more. A lot of them are to divide and conquer, as I said in my talk. And, you know, our job here is not to fall into that trap, but to recognize that building unity means recognizing those differences and respecting them. The other thing I just wanted to say is that, you know, the Cubans, comrades, are very humble about their accomplishments, both in the various articles written about it, about the Families Code, and in you know, in Mariella's message, in at the meeting that I attended with the diplomats. You know, everyone is very humble about the fact that they still have a long way to go on these issues. You know, it's there's no like trying to build it up like everything's perfect. You know, the socialist revolutionary process is a long, you know, it has a lot, there's a lot of moving parts that have to be coordinated, and people have to be united in the struggle, and especially in a small country targeted by imperialism like Cuba, that makes everything harder. So, but I think we can learn from their humbleness, and you know, that we, and you know, take the lesson that we need to learn from each other, from our movements, and work towards uniting them. So we really have a strong working class movement in this country, which is indigenous and Black and queer and Puerto Rican and white and Asian and Latinx and disabled and women and all, you know, genders, all across the gender spectrum.
I just want to, if I may, I just want to emphasize that our youth and then also our elders need to study socialism and really to look at the democratic centralism, participatory, you know, democracy, because I think that a lot of times we and also looking at the big picture instead of saying, well, we can change this because not just because it's good for me, but it's good for everyone. You know, we have to look at the bigger picture. So those that's listening, I really want to thank everyone that took the time out of their day to listen to this webinar. And also just to let people in California know that Southern California, we're going to be working, especially in San Diego, that's where I am, for a resolution. We have the words for the resolution. We're going to work on a resolution to take Cuba off the terrorist list, and also to end the blockade. That's going to be our battle for now. So anyway, thank you so much. This has really been a great, you know, discussion.
Thank you, Gloria.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to raise something that from Mariella's message, and which goes beyond the family code, goes beyond this topic, but it's how she mentioned how it took decades to change this family code. It took a lot of talking, a lot of working with the people, and it, you know, from Puerto Rico, we want to end colonialism. We want independence, and this is just an example. It can be any kind of goal that we have with the people. How sometimes we want something, we know that the people need something, but we as the movement cannot be behind the people. We can, I mean, we cannot be behind, but we cannot be forward from where the people are. And we need to, at the same time that we have consciousness raising campaigns, educational campaigns that some people call it educational. I prefer to use the word consciousness raising, so we can elevate the consciousness of the people, and then we can push forward new policies, new progressive policies. And it's so important for us in the movement, on the progressive movement, how to work with the people, how to move at the same time that we push, but we also elevate, try to do the most to elevate the consciousness, because that's the only way that can guarantee. We cannot force something just because we think it's right, but we have to make sure that it completely goes with the people and that it can be consistent and it can be sustained by the people, because only the people will be able to sustain whatever progressive developments. And we see in Latin America, we see in Peru, we see in Bolivia, it's I think that's a very, very valuable lesson. For us, it's here in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you.
I saw someone in the chat say that how can people in San Diego, help with the efforts of passing the resolution. And I don't know if you're able to do that. I don't know if I am, but if you could post the contact information for the panelists so that people, if panelists are okay with that, and so that people can contact me specifically as we start working with the city council in San Diego to do that. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Want to win? Oh, cool, great. That's fine too. Yeah. So thanks to all our panelists. Cheryl, did you already go? Oh, Cheryl already went.
It's very interesting to me that this webinar has sparked a lot of people wanting to get active, and that's the purpose of us coming together. It's not just to learn, which is to learn, but also to intersect with each other and find ways to unite. I'd like to echo Melinda's words about the importance of us finding ways to join together. That's one of the National Network on Cuba. The one thing that the 50 organizations can agree on is Cuba, ending the blockade, returning Guantanamo, normalizing relations. On other things, there are many different opinions, but we found the one thing that we can unite on. And so in the broader political movement, that's with all of the challenges that are facing us and increasing challenges that are facing us, it becomes all the more necessary to have that movement that's respectful of the most oppressed and has leadership from all the sectors of society, that includes everyone in a respectful way, so we can be united. That's all.
Thanks.
And the blockade.
The blockade.
Off the list.
That's it, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. And definitely stay following Women in Struggle, and we'll have more discussions like this. And we hope to see you all soon. And yeah, have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.